Welcome to Career Coffee Chat Live. I'm your host, Erin Urban, and so excited to have you join us today. So come on in, pull up a chair, and join us for a great conversation around how to craft more purpose-filled work and getting more meaning into your work and in your life. And I find right now a lot of us are searching for that more meaning, that purpose. What are we here for? And finding that passion, drive to build up enthusiasm. Because quite frankly, for those of you tuning in here live or tuning into the replay later, I feel that most of us are suffering from a little bit of meh. We're not quite enthusiastic these days. So, what is going on? And how can we, not only as leaders and organizations, but as individuals, put more purpose in our work and our life? So, welcome to Career Coffee Chat Live. Again, my name is Erin Urban. If you've never seen my smiling face before, you can learn more about me at coachyurban.com. And of course, don't forget the podcast, which is on all available channels, including my YouTube channel. You can find that at Coachy Urban as well. So hop on over and subscribe and be the first to be notified for all of these live events and get access to all the replays. But my biggest question for you, my friends, as you tune in here today, I want to say hi to you, welcome you to the show. So as you hop on, please say hi, say your name, and say where you're from, because this show is all about you and having more fun at work. Should we have more fun at work? I think we should. Because why are people so disengaged? And most importantly, can you create more motivation in your work and life? So get these answers today, my friends, by tuning in with our great guest, Jonathan Westover. With employee engagement at an all-time low, I feel it can be a big struggle to understand how to infuse our flagging workplace cultures with more enthusiasm. What's really interesting is while many millions are looking for that more meaning in the workplace, not only can leaders make sure that is there for their cultures, but you, my friends, can also make sure that you have more meaning in your work and in your life. So you'll be excited to learn that the tools and skills needed to craft more purposeful work is right at your very fingertips, whether you're a leader within an organization looking to thrive in those teams and making sure those teams are motivated, or whether you as an individual are looking for motivation. So, a little bit about our great guest today. Jonathan Westover, Ph.D., is an award winning US based Amazon #1 best-selling author. He's also ranked #1 HR Innovation Future Work Global Thought Leader and Influencers in Thinkers 360. He's ranked the top 30 in management and organizational culture, Global Gurus, and has been included on Leaders Hum Power List of the top 200 biggest voices in leadership to watch for 2022. So I want to help you join me in a warm welcome to John. Great to have you on the show today. Great to talk to you about finding more purpose in our work life. And I talk about work life because, as you know, it's more inside of our lives than oftentimes we give credit for in the past. So, John, I've mentioned a lot about the awesome accolades that you have, but you got this great sweatshirt here because you're a professor at a university. So share with us a little bit about what you're doing there in the university.
Well, thank you first for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I appreciate the opportunity to join your show and engage with your audience. Like you said, I tried to do a number of things to stay engaged with industry. I consider myself a scholar practitioner, so I am a university professor. And that's always been my #1 gig, so to speak. And I do consulting work and thought leadership and writing and engagements and speaking and all those other things kind of on the side. But I'm a professor at Utah Valley University. I'm chair of the organizational leadership department. I also work as academic director in their Center for Social Impact, in addition to a few other roles that I play on campus. I teach and do research in the areas of HR, leadership, ethics and corporate social responsibility, social impact, and those sorts of topics. So that's what I wake up and do every day. And I love working with the students. But in terms of being a scholar practitioner, I've always felt like it's really important for professors to have a tight connection with industry, to not just be kind of stuck in their ivory tower. I do lots of academic research. But the reality is, if I work for a couple years on this big study and do this big project and I publish it in a really great peer-reviewed academic journal, the reality is, even a really well-read, well-cited article in a scientific journal is only going to reach hundreds, maybe thousands of people.
Mm-hmm.
And if you really want to get the ideas and the impacts down, to the end of the row, I think you have to engage with practitioners and people who are, dealing with these issues day
Right.
in and day out. And so
Right.
I try
Right.
to write and do work that translates my academic research into
Mm-hmm.
practitioner oriented materials for further reach and dissemination, those sorts of things. So, anyways, that's a little bit about me and my background.
Great, great. Thank you for sharing. And I think it's so true. I mean, when I was in university, I recognized quite quickly that while everything that I was learning was great in theory, it's important to actually have it understood in practice. And I also
Right.
want to say hi to those people tuning in today to the live show. Hi, Mariama, tuning in from YouTube. She says hi to us. Great to see you again. And as you tune in, whether you're watching live or listening to the replay or watching the replay later or listening to the podcast, feel free to send us a note. We will be notified and we'd love to hear from you. So, that's very, very true. I find that if we stay in our theory box, we may not necessarily be connecting to reality. And I think the reality is right now that people aren't feeling it when it comes to the workplace. Almost everybody I've talked to, whether they're an entrepreneur, whether they're working inside of an organization or corporation, they don't necessarily feel the oomph, the motivation, the drive that was there, maybe even during the pandemic in 2021 and 2020. I feel like we're all kind of meh. And it would be great to tackle that a little bit during our conversation, understand how to put more meaning back into the workplace because I feel a lot of people are searching for that. But before we start talking about that, John, I'd like to know, you're doing all this great, well, you have all this great focus work. Why? Because you could do anything, but why this? What was that thing? Was there a moment in time that made a catalyst for you to choose this focus for your work?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about this over the years. And I'm sure there were a lot of things. We all have various inflection points in our lives,
Mm-hmm.
that take us down different paths. So I'm sure there are a lot of things I could point to, but there is one thing in particular that really changed my trajectory. And as many students do in their undergrad years, I changed majors a few times.
Mm-hmm.
And I had ended up as an accounting major. And the university I was at, really great, top 5 national accounting program. It's a stable career. You're going to be successful and stable and just make a good living. I was good at it, and so I was doing this program, and I had spent about a year in the program and realized that I didn't enjoy it. And for a long time, I pushed that feeling down because I felt like
Mm-hmm.
that's just what being an adult is. As you grow up
Isn't
and
that
you're an adult,
sad?
you
That's so
just
sad.
have to kind of stuff
Yeah.
it down, and you just have to
Mm.
show up and do the work. And I'm like, I can do that. But as time went on, I thought more and more, oh, I don't know if I can do that. And then one day, I had actually lived for a couple of years in South Korea, and I was studying Korean language and I was minoring in Korean. My Korean professor came to class one day. He's like, he had connections, back in Korea, and he's
Mm-hmm.
like, who would like to go do a summer internship back in Korea? And I didn't know what I would be doing, what company it would be with. I just raised my hand. I didn't have any other summer plans at that point. I'm like, that would be awesome. I'd love to go back. And it turned out that the opportunity was working in the corporate organizational development office with LG
Ah,
Electronics, a big tech firm.
yeah.
And and next thing I know, I'm out there spending the summer doing a completely different kind of work, and I completely fell in love with it. As much as I felt meh about all the accounting stuff I was doing,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and by the way, let me just say, I'm glad we have people who love accounting. And it's a great
Yes,
profession,
absolutely.
and we need people to do it. So I don't mean
Yeah.
to poo-poo accounting, but for me, it just, more and more I realized, oh, that's not something I want to do. and and being embedded in this, kind of like the Google of
Mm-hmm.
Korea, 20 plus years ago, being embedded in that kind of an environment, just engaging and exciting and doing really cool work and executive retreats and trainings and organizational assessments, all those sorts of things. That's what I was doing. I'm like, this is awesome. So when I got done with the internship, I come home, I return to the university, I go back into my accounting classes, and within 3 weeks of the start of the semester, I'm like, I can't do
You're done.
this. And so I went and I talked to my professors. I'm like, I want to do what I did over the summer. How do I do that? And we didn't have, the university didn't have like an HR program or anything at the time. And so they said, go do social science. So I ended up I changed my major one more time. I switched from accounting to sociology, and I minored in business. And that changed my trajectory, because I did that with the mind towards, I wanted to work in HR, OD, change
Because that's what
management.
we knew of it at the time. It was mostly HR and OD driven. Yeah. And now we have, consulting firms that do only, leadership development consulting and that sort of thing, which is fantastic. So we've come a long way in this period of time, short period of time, over, theoretically. But yeah, so thank you, John. I mean, it's tremendous. But I really, something you mentioned struck a chord with me. I feel like I just need to push it down, because this is what being an adult is. And I've been on this kind of hot button for a little while, for a number of weeks, around, adulting isn't all it's cracked up to be. Maybe, adulting sucks, quite frankly. Do we really, we're not having enough fun in our work and in our lives. We really aren't, because we're adulting too much, I feel like. And I think maybe we've come to the saturation point as a culture, as a society, where we're all feeling a bit meh because we're adulting too much. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I mean, it with any job, with any relationship, with anything we do in life, not everything is always fun and exciting, and there's
Sure.
tedium, and there's the mundane, and there's the things that you don't like to do, and that's the reality. And so part of adulting is just recognizing that you're going to have to suck it up sometimes and do things that you don't necessarily like to do. The question, I think, is about the balance, right? And if you find yourself spending 90% of every day adulting and doing the stuff you can barely stomach, I'm concerned for you,
Right.
if that's the situation. If it's like 80, if you're doing like spending 80% of your time doing stuff that's meaningful and purpose driven, and you derive value from it, and then you have that 20% that you just have to do the stuff, you have to clean the toilets, you got to do the paperwork, you got to do the stuff nobody wants to do.
Pay taxes, that kind of thing.
Pay taxes. I mean, that's inevitable, and you're going to have to do that. But that balance seems to be, reasonable. And you can do the things you need to do that you don't necessarily want to do, and then re-energize doing the other stuff, right? And that's, when I was doing accounting, for me, again, that was not the best fit. And it would have been kind of that 10% versus 90% kind of an equation, I think, where there would have been some things I liked about it, but mostly it would have been kind of soul crushing work for me. I don't think that would have been sustainable. And so I think I'm really grateful that I had that awakening at the time, because I meet so many people who are about my age. I'm 43. So many people who get into their late 30s, early 40s, and you hear about, midlife crises.
Yes.
Why does that happen? There's a variety of reasons, but a lot of times it's because people went down a path that society kind of told them was the right path, or their parents expected them to do it, or it was prestigious, or they're going to make a lot of money, or whatever. And so they decide, I'm going to do this thing regardless of how it actually fits with their disposition and kind of what helps them drive meaning and purpose. And then all of a sudden you get 20 years down the road, and you take stock on things, and you're like, I am not happy. I don't like what I'm doing every day.
I don't like what I'm doing anymore. Yeah, this doesn't bring me joy. And it happens a lot. I mean, there's when you call about mid-career crisis, it's a thing. This is where I coach. This is why the Zone of Genius coaching, that's where it came from. There's like all these people coming to me going, I don't like what I'm doing. I don't feel energized by what I'm doing, and they feel kind of handcuffed, because either they spend a lot of years, a lot of time and energy, have a lot of skills. By the way, you can have a lot of skills, for those of you tuning in now or later, but that doesn't mean that skills bring you energy or joy. You can be great at something you hate to do.
I was really good at accounting.
Yeah, yeah.
I hated it.
Yeah, I mean, it just wasn't where it gave you energy, and
Yeah.
I feel like that mid-career crisis is a part of that as we evolve out of someone who is becoming more self-authoring because of these stages of adult development. When you're younger, you're taking your direction, if you will, and prioritize from what other people are telling you, versus your parents and society, your friends, those people you're around, of what's expected of you. That's what drives your prioritization matrix, not necessarily the deeper inner meaning of who you are. Now, from time to time, I do meet young people who are more introspective and thinking about, hey, who am I? And this will evolve over time. So when you reach late 30s, early 40s, about that time in your life, you've been around the world enough, the world's turned enough times and the sun's come up and down enough to where you kind of know more about what you like, what you don't like, who you are, and you become more self authoring. And at that point, sometimes the light bulb goes off and goes, wait a minute, this is not for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think we're seeing more of that now after 2020, that people had kind of an enforced pause, whether they liked it or not. So, John, I know that you do work with organizations and leaders around helping create those cultures and workplaces where people can find meaning and purpose. So, you'd like to share with us a little bit about, if you're seeing a lot of attrition right now in the workplace, what can you do? Because the chances are it's not because people don't want to work. It may be because you're not providing them the right tools and methods and structure.
Yeah, and we were chatting in the pre-interview a little bit about some of these topics around the great resignation, the great reevaluation, the great reawakening, whatever term you want to use,
Right.
or quiet quitting. Like the reality is, people have been actively disengaged for years. Gallup's been
Mm-hmm.
tracking this globally for years, and it's a staggering number of the actively disengaged people in the workplace. And so, quiet quitting is kind of the new buzz term, but it's really not a new concept, and it's really not a new phenomenon at all. But I think because of all the conversations, because of the pandemic, because of all the conversations about the Great Resignation, because of the tight labor market, there's been renewed kind of energy around this idea of quiet quitting. And you kind of have the two different perspectives from the employer side, from leaders. I hear lots of leaders talking about quiet quitting and bemoaning, the this reality that they're having a hard time staffing, getting good people to come to the organization in the first place. And when they do come, they have a lot of people that are quote unquote quiet quitting, and they're frustrated by people not being willing to like be more committed and put more time and effort in and such. Um, but if you look at it from the employee side, you have to ask yourself the question, like why would I go above and beyond consistently again and again and again if I'm constantly being overworked, if
Right.
I'm committed to my organization, but there's no reciprocal commitment to me. They could lay me off at any time. I mean, we
Exactly.
just saw last week with Twitter and Facebook laying off, tens of thousands of people
Yeah.
combined.
Yeah.
That's the reality, is that organizations at the snap of their fingers can lay off a huge chunk of their labor force,
Mm-hmm.
and there's really not any recourse on the side of employees. And so
Exactly.
you're overwhelmed from the pandemic and burned out from the pandemic. Simultaneously, I mean, the grass isn't always greener, but it's a tight labor market. You know that you have more voice and power uh,
Exactly.
in the labor market than perhaps in years past. And then you look at how you're being treated in your organization, how you're being perhaps overworked, underappreciated,
Mm-hmm.
perhaps even exploited. And why wouldn't people recalibrate their effort?
Exactly.
Why would people continue in that kind of a situation? Why would, if they've been putting in 60, 70, 80-hour weeks,
It's not
for a
sustainable.
40-hour a week job, why would they continue doing that when they could just recalibrate, pull back, and then spend that extra time and energy on their side hustle, right? And go do something different that's
Right.
energizing to them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I completely understand the whole idea around quiet quitting. I understand how it can be frustrating for organizations. It's also, I mean, if I have a leader come to me and say, we're really frustrated by this, we're not sure what to do about it, if they try to pass the blame on to employees, um, I say you need to look in the mirror, because it's really an indictment of leadership, and it's an indictment of the organization and how they're treating their people. If you treat your people well with dignity and respect, you pay them fairly and equitably. You create an engaging workplace environment that's inclusive, psychologically safe, where people are
Mhm.
excited to show up to go to work, where they can feel supported and do cool stuff. Guess what? You're not going to have too much of a
You're
hard
not
time
going to have a problem.
attracting and
Yeah.
retaining good
Mhm.
people and getting good effort out of them, right? But if those
Exactly.
things aren't in place, yeah, you're going to struggle because people
Mhm.
have options.
Yeah, they absolutely do, and now more than ever, and they have more of a voice. And what's really interesting, John, I may not make any friends by pointing this out, but historically, organizations have gotten away with this type of behavior because
Yep.
the labor market has been a bit reversed, and they've been in this more of a seat of power, so they haven't had, I guess, the requirement to change. It's they could get away with. They literally could. So, their traditional model, quite frankly, doesn't work. It just doesn't. And I'm one of those people that says the old organizational model and the culture that has historically been in place, which they've dug a big nasty cesspit hole right now then to dig themselves out of, because they're so entrenched in these thought processes and ways of being that it never worked to begin with, but people just put up with it. Let's take my generation, for example, and
That's
I
right.
think
Yeah.
you're the same, Gen Xer, maybe you're early millennial, I don't know, but I'm a Gen Xer. Nobody talks about us anyway, whatever. We don't count. But when we came into the labor market, we were given a choice. We were like, hey, here it is. This top down, you do as I say leadership for the most part, very hierarchical, very siloed mentality, not very inspiring place to go into. And we weren't really given a choice. So we just, well, okay, I have to adult,
Right.
right? I mean, go into this place and put up with it. Well, you know, our children looked at us and watched. Okay, you're working how many hours a week? And what are you doing with your life? You get maybe 2 vacations a year if you're lucky. You're working ridiculous hours, and oh, the economy swung. You got laid off. Then they're stressed. So they're watching this. And these people, young people at that point, now grown up, gone through college, coming into the labor force, some are now actually in positions of, more voice and management leadership positions, are saying, no, we're not doing this anymore. No, enough's enough. You invest in us, we'll invest in you. It's a give and take. It's not constantly this take, 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 take. And
Yeah.
I used to call it corporate slavery. I still do. And there's a reason why. And it's not them, browbeating corporations and saying bad leaders are all bad. That's not the case. We must become more comfortable with letting go of that which no longer serves us. And it's
Yeah.
going to be uncomfortable trying to figure out what the next path is as we evolve. It's necessary. The time has come.
Yeah. I think, as I, so I'm what has been dubbed Zennial. So I'm like right tail end of Gen X, right at the front end of millennial,
Mm-hmm.
born in 79. And so I'm kind of in that in between. I really relate to both groups in a lot of different
Mm-hmm.
ways. Um, the reality is, like, you're absolutely right. I think previous generations just had a different kind of set of expectations around the workplace relationship, and
Right.
what it meant, what that psychological contract was in terms of
Mm-hmm.
how you show up to work. That has shifted so dramatically over the last several decades, and everything you just said about how expectations have changed in younger people. I see it every day. I teach university students. Now we have a lot of non-traditional students too. So I do teach students who are in their 30s, 40s, even 50s. But the vast majority are students in their 20s, and they know better because I teach them like what a successful organization looks like, what
Right.
good leadership looks like, what good HR practice and policy looks like. Like, they
Mm-hmm.
are learning about this in the university space. There's lots of research to back up everything we're talking about, and so they leave um, with an understanding and a different kind of an expectation about like what good leadership is. And if they're going into a workplace where they're treated crummy, where it's where there's I mean, certainly if there's anything like sexism, bigotry, anything like that, that's a non-starter. They
Oh
don't
yeah, that's
have
out.
anything to do with it. But if there's bullying behaviors, if you just have kind of the jerk boss, a psychologically unsafe or uninclusive kind of an environment, they don't want to be there, and they know better. They know that it should be better, and they're
Mhm.
going to look for those types of opportunities. So we can bemoan that, and sometimes millennials or Gen Z get called entitled, or they're not willing to put in the work. They just want to immediately jump ahead in their career, and there may be some amount of limited truth to that kind of a mentality, but for the most part, I just think they know better. They have what I consider to be completely reasonable expectations. I would expect the same thing
Right.
from my leaders. And a lot of the idea around entitlement, I think, comes from just their desire to be mentored and coached and have opportunities for career development and
Hmm.
advancement. And they want to do work that's meaningful and purpose driven. Whereas, previous generations might have been willing to do that crappy job adulting for 10, 20, 30 years until they got to the point where they could do work that was meaningful to them. Younger generations just not willing to do that. You can say that's entitled. You can say that's them not being willing to pay their dues. I just think it's reasonable expectations
I
and
think it's called evolution.
evolution. Yeah.
I think it's called evolution. We're seeing, and I believe that because of what we've experienced globally with the pandemic and our social structures being changed dramatically and a lot of shifts happening in a very, very short period of time, that this has been the time frame of this evolution has compressed. So now we're seeing much more change in a much shorter period of time because of all these other influencing factors. And well, let's face it, people don't like change, right?
Yep.
They don't like change. And corporations have been doing this way, this mode of thinking, this business, this type of process. I mean, the whole process has been in place for such an embarrassingly long time. And it was based on the feudal system, people. Let's give I mean, really, it's feudal. It's a feudal system. I mean, how old? We must evolve. We must evolve. And people are evolving. It's time for corporations to understand that they have to too, and knowing what that looks like can be interesting because as an individual, let's say an individual inside the organization, sometimes we have this Gossamer view that HR leaders, they should just know. They don't just know. No one gave them a crystal ball. I have an 8 ball here, but that's about as close as we get. Okay.
And I think I'm a believer in the general goodness of people. I think most
Mhm.
leaders want to do right by their people. I think very few, I mean, there are the psychopaths and sociopaths out there, but the vast majority of people wake up in the morning wanting to treat people well. I don't think most
Mhm.
people get up thinking, how am I going to exploit my people today?
Right.
So I do give people the benefit of the doubt. I think people have good intentions, but the problem is whatever your intentions are don't necessarily matter if what you do doesn't line up with those intentions. And nobody expects perfection. So I might, as a leader, have aspirational goals and I want to grow and develop myself so I'm better for my team. That's all
Mhm.
great. And I think your people will evolve with you over time. And I think they will be generous and accommodating of that kind of growth. We all recognize nobody's perfect, but we do want to see the effort. And if there's a
Mhm.
complete disconnect, excuse me, between what people are consistently saying, they say all the right things, they say all the right values, but then the daily lived experience in the team and
Mhm.
in the workplace is one of toxicity, bullying, hyper, unproductive competitiveness, uh,
Micromanagement.
micromanagement,
We're
all of
not sure
those
they're
things.
working virtually, so let's put bots on their computer.
Yeah, when that happens, then it doesn't really matter what you say because what you're doing speaks way louder than words, and
Right.
people will adjust based on those behaviors. So we do need to work as leaders. We need to work on better alignment between what we say and what we do, to try to be as consistent as possible. Again, recognizing we're not perfect and we never will be, but if we mess up, like being willing to own it.
Mhm.
As so many leaders, I think they fear acknowledging a misstep. They fear, just saying, "Oh, I kind of blew that one. Let's talk about it. Let's figure out how we can do this better next time. I'm sorry. I'm going to do better." Like they really fear saying that,
Yeah.
and it kind of boggles my mind, because when you are willing to be vulnerable enough to say that, you're not eroding trust in you. You're not eroding the trust that people have in you. You're
Mhm.
actually, that vulnerability is helping to develop
Building.
more trust.
Yeah.
People aren't stupid. They know if you messed up. And if you are pretending like you didn't mess up, or you try to like blame shift and pass it off to them, or gaslight or something like that, that erodes trust, right? So just own up
Yes.
to it and just, say, yes, we're going to work on this. I want to get better at this. We can all help each other. People appreciate that.
Mhm.
So that kind of a component, I do think it's important to acknowledge that most leaders are trying, but let's work towards better alignment.
Mhm.
And when we're making real good faith efforts towards that and communicating openly with our people about those efforts, and just learning together, that goes a really really long way,
Yes.
as people are trying to find their place in your team and in the workplace.
Mhm. And to your point, leaders, HR folks, organizational development folks, I mean, your corporations don't have it all figured out. And they are also very stressed trying to understand what this great reset, if you will, what that means for the workplace. What does the future work look like? What what is our structures? How do we communicate? And it's more than, it goes way beyond, virtual, hybrid. I mean, way beyond that. That's just superficial, to be honest with you.
Right.
Much, much deeper, way beyond that. I mean, right down to how the work streams are generated or created. I mean, silos never worked. But they're still like attached to them. Just rethinking. Okay, well, do we have people doing more autonomous work? How, is this more, leader as coach, collaborative leader? A lot of change coming. So here is something people I don't think understand. They have a lot more power in this as the individual to help their organizations understand how to support them, because they're flailing right now. They're just flailing around. They're not quite sure. Hopefully they get a consultant, but they may not, or get the right consultant. And so how do you as the individual craft more meaning and purpose in your work?
Yeah.
Because we
Yeah.
have a lot more impact than we actually leverage. I don't think people understand that they can go, hey, I really like to your point, I've been doing accounting, but I played with this special project over here, did some O&D work. I really like that. I really like organizational development. This is where my gifts and strengths and talents are. How can we, make sure that I can add value to the organization by leveraging that? People don't have those conversations. They really don't, and they can.
Yeah. In an ideal world, we will all work for enlightened, excuse me, enlightened organizations where they get all of this and they're actively, working on, the redesign of work and infusing engagement and energy and meaning and purpose into the jobs that everyone does. In the ideal world, that would be the case. But we don't live in the ideal world, and most of us don't work for those organizations. There are, the rare examples where they just are killing it, right? And they're just hitting it out of the park. And
Right.
those are the places to work. That's where everyone wants to work, right? Their employer brand is so strong. They're not struggling to attract and retain good people at those organizations, right?
Mhm.
But most places aren't like that. So do we just throw our hands in the air and say, well, I guess I'm out of luck and I'm just going to have to adult and have a miserable work experience? And I don't think that's the case either.
No.
Because the reality is, and especially if I'm a leader in an organization at whatever level, I may supervise a team of 4 people. Regardless of the broader culture of the organization, it could be the most toxic Enron-esque kind of place ever. But frankly, if I create a really great environment for my little team, then I create a little bubble. Like within my sphere of influence, I have a
Mhm.
lot of power to be able to create the environment that I want for me and my team.
Yes.
Um, and so, and it goes the other way too, though. You could work in the greatest organization, but if you have a really bad boss, that can make that team a miserable experience. So,
Mhm.
the role of an individual leader, at the ground level, interacting with their team members, that's a really important role. Anyone listening who's in a leadership role, think about that. And I think you have within your sphere of influence, there's a lot you can do, even if you don't have a lot of influence outside, in
Hmm.
the broader organization. But as individual employees, even if I don't have that enlightened boss, that person that's trying to create that kind of an environment, what can I do to infuse meaning and purpose into the work that I do? Now, there's only so much I can do, and if I'm in a truly toxic environment, then I probably need to leave. Just like I would say to someone who's in an abusive home, get out of there. Like you do not stick around. You
You
do
can't
not try
fix
to
them.
wait. Yeah, you don't wait for them to try to figure it out and get better and
Mhm.
whatever, and cycle of abuse, etc. Like if you're in a toxic environment with a toxic boss, you need to leave. You just need to go
Mhm.
somewhere else.
Right.
Um, but if we're not talking about that level of toxicity, we're really just talking about, I just don't feel it. I just don't get excited when I get up in the morning. I'm not like pumped to
Mhm.
go to work. I kind of dread it. It's kind of soul sucking. Um, then there might be an opportunity for a career shift or career change, and that's really worth exploring. But if
Mhm.
if you feel like, no, I'm in the job I want to be in, I'm just not feeling it, then at that point, take some time to reassess what your work life looks like, what your daily activities look like. What could you do to infuse more meaning and purpose into those daily tasks? And again, if it's, if we think about the ratio of like, I'm just making this number up, but let's say 80% stuff you like doing, 20% stuff you don't like doing. Let's say that's the magic number. I'm not convinced it is, but I'm just making that up. But let's say that's the magic number of the ratio, but you feel like you're out of whack and it's more like 50-50. Okay, well,
Mhm.
what can you do to nudge it towards that 80% so that you're spending most of your time doing stuff that you have passion about, stuff that you derive meaning from, and that can transform everything else that happens in your work.
Yeah.
I will also say sometimes, again, depending on your boss, depending on your organization, depending on the rigidity or versus flexibility of your job design and work roles and all of that, there may be only so much you can do. But that's one of the reasons why I think the rise of the gig economy is so wonderful, because you can find ways to have other creative expression, to do really cool stuff that may be outside of your day job. You have
Mhm.
that job where you go, 8 to 5, but maybe you have something you could spend an extra 10 hours a week as a passion project outside of your normal day job as a little entrepreneurial kind of gig endeavor. And even if you don't make a ton of money from it, you might be able to derive a lot of meaning and value and purpose from it that can help kind of reinvigorate the rest of your work life, in your day job. So I
Mhm.
do think as individuals, as much as I want organizations to take the lead on these sorts of things, I can also take ownership over how I design my own work life
Mhm.
integration, and and take some responsibility for how I'm going to create meaning in my own career.
Yeah, I mean, you have a very valid point. Um, and one of the red flags that raises for me is that we're encouraging a lot of work here because you're going to be putting in, potentially less work in your day job if you do have this side gig. That, and quite frankly, that's the way it happens a lot of times. Not always, but a lot of times. So what else can you do? And I feel like right now, and this has always been the case, but people have been too afraid to leverage these tools. We just going and having a conversation. Now, if you don't feel like your organization is the type that you can have a conversation to check out, hey, what are my opportunities? This is my gifts. These are my talents. These are my strengths and my expertise. Here's the business case, how I can leverage these to add value to the organization. If you cannot have that conversation at your workplace at all whatsoever, then probably chances are you need to go somewhere else.
Yeah.
But I would have to say that for most people, they do have the opportunity to have that type of conversation. They can actually go to decision makers, whether that's their direct line of management or otherwise, and have these types of just, hey, this is what I do. This is how I shine, and this is how I can add value to the organization and to the company. In fact, I took that risk myself years and years ago, way before there was a gig economy or a great reset or anything like that. I mean, it was many, many moons ago. And as a result of that conversation, I took a big risk. I took a leap. I applied for a position I didn't even want. It was way above my pay grade, but I knew I would get access to certain key influential decision makers. And because I could get access to them through this interview process, I was able to put forth my business case. Hey, here's what I'm great at. You know me for what I do day in and day out. People don't memorize your resume or pay attention to all the other things you can do because that's not what they're seeing. What they
Right.
see is what they know. So being able to give them more knowledge and say, hey, this is what I'm great at. And oh, by the way, this is how it can benefit the business is tremendous. And people don't leverage this. I highly encourage this, particularly now because we have a lot of people who are just, nah, I don't really, I don't like what I'm doing, or this is not fun anymore. So how can I have more fun? You can infuse more meaning and purpose in your role by going out and having these conversations with people that matter.
Yeah, and if I can just double click on that for a second,
Mm-hmm.
um, sometimes, hopefully, you are in a place where you can go talk to your direct supervisory line, your
Mm-hmm.
boss, and have this kind of conversation. Hopefully, they'll be open to it. They won't, be, some in some way intimidated by it or put off by
Mm-hmm.
it. If you can have that conversation, awesome. But the reality is, sometimes people do feel like that's not safe, or you're afraid your boss might be threatened by it, or may feel like you're unloyal because you're saying these things. So sometimes you don't feel like you can have that conversation with your boss. If that's the case, though, chances are, if you're in an organization of any size, not just a small startup or mom and pop kind of shop, if it's of any size, chances are you can have conversations with other people in adjacent areas, where you can have those conversations, where they're not going to be threatened by it, where they're not going to be put off by it, and that can open lots of doors. So maybe you stay in your current job but have new cross functional opportunities for projects, or maybe you stay at the organization but you shift jobs and you go to work with another person. There's a lot of different ways this can play out, but having those conversations, I think, is really important. And I think, one of the great things that comes from that is just a sense of empowerment, that I do have
Mm-hmm.
some control over my career, that I'm not just stuck, that I'm not just dependent on the whims of, whatever the person above me says that I can do or I have to do. So let's take back a little bit of ownership. We have more employee voice now than we've had in the recent past.
Yeah.
Like, let's own it, let's take it,
Mm-hmm.
let's leverage it, and that can make a big, big difference in our daily lived experience in the workplace.
Oh, it's huge. And particularly now, with this live show is airing in the fall. And in the fall, they start creating the budgets for the next year. A great time before the performance review, which always happens in the springtime if they have their act together. It's a great time of year to have these types of conversations. And you also have a fantastic outlet. Holiday parties. Now, if you're meeting in person, of course, it's a little bit better. But a lot of people say, well, I mean, I'm working virtually, I'm working remotely. How can I possibly have these conversations? Well, leverage the tools at your disposal. Chances are you can have these conversations virtually as well. You're like, hey, this is what I'm really great at. I would love to be able to leverage my skills in this area to benefit the business. And why do I keep mentioning benefit the business? Because it is a reciprocative process. You're
Yes.
getting what you want, having more fun at work, having more purpose and meaning, and then the business is getting what they want. And you have these types of conversations with the right people at the right time, they can create a role for you. And it may be a pain point, for example, that you notice, yeah, see, we really need more O&D work, or we really need someone to drive operations in this area, or supply chain is drowning, right? They need help. Well, hey, if that's your gift and talent and there you see a pain point for the organization you can help solve, then that's tremendously rewarding on both sides for you to be able to step in and fill that issue. So we have so much more impact, I think, than we give ourselves credit for. So, John, before we wrap up the show, is there anything else you'd like to share as for people to create more meaning and purpose-filled work life?
I think just recognize that you can. It is possible, and
Mhm.
it's not super complicated. It's not rocket science. There's lots of research on this. Just looking for ways to infuse a little bit more creativity into the work that you do. And when I say creativity, I'm not talking. You know, I mean, if you're an artist or a musician or something, that's great. But we can be creative in anything that we do, like just our strategic
Yeah.
decision making, whatever we do. Like we can be creative. Let's infuse some creativity into what we do a little bit every day. Let's focus on developing relationships, meaningful
Mhm.
relationships with people around us. Because sometimes even when you're kind of in the doldrums of work that you don't really like, if you're doing work you don't particularly like with people you care about and appreciate and um, work well together, that can provide a lot of meaning.
It's huge.
There's just so many things we can do. Um, let's recognize we can do it. Let's take some responsibility over starting to do that within our own jobs, within our own experience. If we're in a leadership position, that's our job too. Like it's my
Mhm.
job to create that environment for my team. So even if there's constraints at the organizational level, look for ways you can impact things within your own sphere of influence, and start today. Just little things consistently over time will make a huge difference.
They do. They absolutely do. And I encourage people to consider infusing more play into the workplace and
Yes.
having more fun at work, if at all possible. And this is for leaders, for your team, and for individuals as well. It's okay to make suggestions. And if you're in a work environment you don't feel like it's okay, well, you're probably in the wrong work environment and need to shift gears to someone else's work environment that you do feel like you can make suggestions and innovate, create it, and just have fun again in the workplace. Don't take adulting too far. So,
Yes.
John, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. As always, great to see you. And for you, my friends, tuning in, and whether you're watching the replay, watching the live show, or watching the replay later, it's always a pleasure to have you on. And feel free, don't be shy, say hi, reach out to us, give us a shout out, give us a star rating on the podcast if you're listening, audio version, or if you're watching live or, like I said, the replay. Send us a note, send us a comment if you have questions. We're here to help. And as always, it's my biggest wish for you, my friends, to keep elevating. Until next time, bye for now.